The Global Leaders Meeting on Women wraps up in China. A number of international dignitaries and delegates attended the event, commemorating the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. That was a landmark agreement promoting women's development and gender equality around the world. We begin with this report from CGTN's Liu Jiaxin in Beijing.
It's an inspiring moment. Look at the number of women leaders here. The last time we have so many women delegates from around the world gathered in Beijing was 30 years ago. Today they are here with confidence and purpose, united by a shared mission to accelerate progress for women's all-around development. Ms. President, Iceland is leading in closing the gender gap. What experiences do you hope to present through this Global Leaders Meeting on women in China?
That if we want to save the world, we need more women to have their voice and values at the table.
In Nicaragua, we have achieved gender equality in our government positions. We can see women that are heading many institutions.
We're looking at our progress that we have made on the areas of the 12 priorities of the declaration, impact of the platform for action. We think we've made some progress, but definitely we're not where we're supposed to be.
Acknowledging that women's all-round development still faces complex challenges and that achieving gender equality remains a long-term task, delegates at the plenary session engaged in further exchanges on safeguarding women's rights and strengthening global cooperation for women's advancement. The summit conveys a message of partnership. From education and health to technology and leadership, delegates agreed that empowering women is key to building a more inclusive and sustainable future. Liu Jiaxin, CGTN, Beijing.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us here in the studio, Seema Wadhwa is the founder and CEO of Net Positive Solutions and a Time 100 climate leader. From Oregon, we're joined by Yan Liang. She is Chair Professor of Economics at Ahmed University here in Washington, D.C. Imani is a cultural curator and an associate professor of digital storytelling at the George Washington University. And from Beijing, we're joined by Zoon Ahmed. She is a research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Zoon, good to see you. Let me start with you. President Xi Jinping of China presented 4 proposals at the meeting, and I just want to run through them very briefly. First one, fostering an enabling environment for women's growth, cultivating a powerful momentum for high-quality development of women's causes, developing a governing framework to protect women's rights, and promoting global cooperation among women. What are your thoughts on the president's priorities for women?
Thank you, Anand, firstly, for having me. We already know that given, the white paper that China published last month, which really talked about all the achievements so far and the various facets in which women's role, participation, and empowerment is actually, is transformative for the country. And it goes on to talk about, on a global level, that cooperation, so encouraging each other through making women's empowerment a core mandate, one that is through actionable, policies, etc. I think in the speech, these 4 points that you mentioned that were in President Xi's speech, they actually talk about, the fact that it's not that we need to empower women. Women need to be provided with an enabling environment, a situation, laws, policies that protect their rights to be able to flourish. We also talked about, how when we are discussing the SDGs, when we talk about also, unfortunately, regions where there's conflict, poverty, it is the women that are affected the most. And in that sense, to strengthen our commitments to those global goals, to that global mandate of sustainable development, we are automatically, prioritizing women's development and growth as well, and it needs to be more targeted. Another thing, as a resident in China for 10 years, what I can tell you is that women's improvement, representation, women being, stakeholders, women being decision makers is something that this country takes very seriously.
Yeah, okay, let's bring it to the studio. Seema, good to see you as well. Thanks for coming in. Now, millions of women have been lifted out of poverty in China, and if we look at the maternal mortality rate, that's dropped. It's dropped considerably, and there's something like 100 maternal and child health initiatives in place in the country right now. So what is your assessment of the progress that China has made?
You know, I think there definitely has been progress in China and globally. But, the perspective I'd like to highlight is, when we think of what the greatest threat to human health is, it's actually climate change. And while that is a threat to everybody, actually women's maternal health is at great risk. In 2020, there was a study looking at the impact of climate and heat on women, and that was by Dr. Bruce Becker. And what was found is that women who are exposed to extreme heat during their last trimester, they actually have lower preterm weights for their children. The children are born earlier. And so, while there's great progress being made, women are more impacted by climate change. And so I think this really creates an opportunity to think through, how do we empower these women? Because we know that it's not just their children's health, it's their own health, and that impacts economic viability as well.
Right, and there must be other effects as well, because we often hear of climate refugees, food insecurity, water insecurity as well. That must affect home life.
It does, so when we think about, again, that disproportional impact, according to UN's women are 14 times more likely to die based on climate displacement. And, we see that with drought as well. But also, one of the facts that I learned that was really unfortunate and disturbing was the fact that, with more climate-related impacts, there are more child brides because farmers are not able to manage their crops. So you don't just see the direct impacts. These are going to be generational impacts with now child brides being married due to the economic impacts from climate change.
Okay, Yan Liang, good to see you, Yan Liang. Now, China is one of UN Women's top 25 financial supporters. It focuses on gender equality and empowering women. It's also financed development in developing countries to the tune of $40 million. They are active actually in about 20 developing countries. How significant are these contributions, especially in the Global South?
Yeah, good to be with you and the panelists. So I think that really echoes what President Xi talked about, this global cooperation, and China is definitely, talks and walks the walks. Especially when it comes to financial support. And at this meeting, President Xi also pledged donate $10 million for UN Women and another $100 million in the next 5 years for China's global development and South-South cooperation funds. And I think these are really substantial. As an economist who work on development finance, I understand really the kinds of gap that, especially when it comes to financing for developing countries. We know now many developing countries are struggling with debt crises, and over 3 billion people live in countries where the government spends more on debt services than on education and health. And of course, women are typically, more, I think, affected negatively by these financial situations. And we also know, globally, women really struggle when it comes to commanding financial resources, right? I mean, 70% of women-owned small and medium enterprises like adequate financing. They're also typically paid more on the interest. So I think all of this just suggests that it's very important for countries like China, and I think all other countries in the world, trying to really provide the financial resources to really empower women, to allow them to command more economic resources. And that is not only good for their own benefits, but also really good for their children, for their family, and for their countries and their society as well. And I also wanted to mention, in addition to these financial resources, I think China also made the commitment of training and providing capacity, building capacities, opportunities for women, right? These, President Xi mentioned inviting 50,000 women and girls to come to China for exchanges and training, and established the Global Center for, women's capacity building. So I think all of these are also very important as a way to really promote, gender development and equality.
Imani, cheers. Great to have you with us. There's also a big focus, Imani, on education. In fact, in 2024, half of Chinese women sought higher education. And looking at some figures right now, women currently make up 40% of the workforce in China. The country itself is advocating for education for women and girls. How big a challenge is this?
Oh, it's incredibly huge. I think one of the things that is really important when we look at globally, women are 50% of the world's population. And it's really critical when we have 50% of people who are currently undereducated. And so what I mean by that is we're not focusing on primary early childhood education, which is critical. We know that getting young people literacy rates are super important. And so it's one of these things that is a major focus globally, in China in particular, focusing on women, 40%, as you just mentioned. But it's really critical because in order to have a prosperous population, education has to be upfront, it has to be centered, it has to be prioritized in a way that I believe China is doing, honestly, far better than the United States. I think it's notable to mention that United States we do not have an official delegation at this conference, which is, troubling to say the least. But the focus is on who is there. And over half of the world's major countries, leaders, those with large, obviously, female populations, and the ones that in particular are focusing on education, moving those 17 sustainable development goals forward. We look at from 1995, when this first summit occurred, to now 2025, and where we are and what have we seen, what lessons have we learned, and we know that education has to be the top priority.
Right, and Imani, there is also the digital gap. Let's listen to the UN Women Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific talking about this particular challenge. Let's watch.
What our data shows us, if you were to unlock the digital divide, for example, between women and men, you'd release over $1 trillion in GDP worldwide. And again, this is where we have a lot to learn from China and the investment that the government has taken to enhance women's use of digitalization as a means of productivity, as a means of equality. China has a sense of reaching exactly where it wants to be. It's got a plan, it's working on that plan, and it's moving forward. It's not complacent. We want to see that continue.
So, Imani, how crucial is it to close that gap, especially as we are seeing right now the rapid emergence of digital economies?
Digital economies, and also, I mean, the reality is as a professor of digital storytelling, where I've been constantly forward thinking for the last 15 years of what are the careers that I am trying to prepare students for that don't even exist right now, and how can we think in a truly forward, digitally capable, and now even with artificial intelligence, it is imperative with education, making sure that education is focusing on everything from media literacy, combating dis, and malinformation has to be critical for, in particular, the Gen Zs, X, Ys, Alphas, as we come back to the top of the alphabet. And when we're really looking at women and young girls and how we can not only engage them in these digital landscapes, but how do we prepare them for careers that even those of us right now who are in education really can't even foresee. What is going to happen next? I'm preparing students every single day and for AI to potentially take over our industry in production and storytelling. And what does that look like? And how do we differentiate content that is coming across our feeds? And it's really important that we focus on that digital gap, what it means for our economies, but what it means also for our own personal safety and security on the internet.
Zoon, you mentioned earlier on the white paper that was released by China's State Council Information Office. That paper, its full title is China's Achievements in Women's Well-Rounded Development in the New Era. You mentioned some of what was in there, but what are the other main points in that paper?
Well, Anand, as I mentioned, one of the things that a lot of our panelists have already mentioned is that China has, from a governance perspective, from an education perspective, from a health perspective, consistently prioritized women's development, women's inclusion in the workforce, women's participation. So the white paper really, for someone who's trying to understand how far China has come, especially since the year 2012, in terms of, what are the policies that have been introduced to improve women's employment, what are the policies that have been introduced to improve health, as was also mentioned, women tend to be the most vulnerable in situations of poverty or uncertainty. Another thing, if we go point by point, well, the economic, political, cultural, social, and also ecological rights of women have been clearly stated. China has also mentioned in this paper, how modernization needs to prioritize the inclusion of women. And by that, they mean, obviously, when we talk about 800 million people out of poverty, specifically how many programs, how many hundreds of billions have been spent already to ensure that women entrepreneurs have more resources. And again, the workplace opportunities that women tended to be discriminated in has considerably been reduced. We also see a mention of the whole process, people's democracy, that it is incomplete without the active participation and the active role of women in that process. Also, how many legislations, how many laws and policies have been introduced to make sure that women have a more equal footing, more rights, more space in the work environment, and also that women-targeted legislation has become a top priority.
Right. Seema, if we look at what is going on in China right now, the will is there and the policy prescriptions are being put into place. But, you mentioned one of the challenges, and that is the impact that climate change has on improving the rights of women in many, many countries and their progress in society as well. But there are other things. There's extreme poverty in many countries around the world. There's conflict, there's wars, as we see. These are formidable obstacles. But what are you seeing in terms of the efforts being made to overcome them?
As we look at where we are right now, it's true. It is what's ahead of us is formidable. But if we look as to how much we have accomplished, what I see is that progress is possible. And I think, what's possible ahead of us is working with organizations, leading organizations, forming organizations that put women in places of power. One such organization is Scientista. It's a new organization that is focused on lifting up women to focus on climate change. And, I think that's a noble organization, but I think what it really comes down to is these issues. We know that if we have women leading in solving the problems, it isn't just something that is going to create, a small impact. It has ripple effects. So whether we're looking at poverty, whether we're looking at health, whether we're looking at governance, placing women in places of power lifts up all tides.
Yang, gender equality was also part of the declaration, with President Xi stating that, I'm quoting here, equality between men and women remains a lofty yet arduous task, unquote. The World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap report in 2025 revealed that at present, it will take 123 years to close the global gender gap, and that's compared to an estimated 99 years back in 2019. Which tells us that there hasn't been much progress. Why is that?
Well, I think there are many reasons. And I think, yes, the current situation is very challenging. When you look at the SDG goals, number 5, about gender equality, we're only about 15.4% on track towards the target. So I think, geopolitical and, these all, conflicts and wars these are really also very important, I think, obstacles, right? And as President Xi talked about, 600 million women and girls are murdered in war and conflict, and 10% of women are in this extreme poverty. And I think, couple that with climate change that has a rapid and severe impact on women, as well as, we're talking about this digital transformation and revolution. I think all of these tend to widen the gap, right? Because women, they're already earning somewhere between 10 and 30% less than men. They're also much weaker in the decision-making power. As a matter of fact, according to the UN, almost half of the married women, they're still not having the decision-making power over sexual and reproductive health. And I think that is just very dire situation when it comes to, we're not fostering this environment, right, in some peace and security and stability for women to participate in their economic, social, and political life. And at the same time, I think we're also not providing the sufficient legal and governance system to allow women to make their way to the leadership. And I really also wanted to echo, my panelists has talked about women in leadership is very important, not only to amplify the voice of women's collective, interests, but also really to cement any of the progress that has been made so far. And I think that is very essential. So what needs to happen, I think, really is, again, to make sure that this kinds of digital divide, as we mentioned earlier, is not going to continue to widen and marginalize women in their economic participation.
Imani, cheers. There was a comment made recently by Dilma Rousseff, the former president of Brazil, who is now the president of the New Development Bank, and she said, and I'm quoting her here directly, she said, in a world facing multiple crises, women are not a problem to solve, they are a solution to embrace. She went on to say, the Global Leaders Meeting on Women must reflect that truth, not only in its declarations, but in the actions it inspires. History is calling once again, and we must answer with courage, clarity, and collective will. What are your thoughts on that statement, that women must be seen as the solution, not the problem?
Well, I think it's really poignant and quite posed at this moment to really be the rallying cry. Women should be at the seats of the table. I think it's also really interesting when we host these summits and these world leaders, and we look at their governments and see that right there, we don't see women in positions of significant leadership. And we see that all across the board. So it's critical, it's timely. Women are not a problem. They are solutions to actually most of the world's ails. When we look globally, whether it be through conflict, definitely resolution, ask women. Ask women. They will be the ones to lead us into the future.
Zoon, the next meeting will be held in 5 years. UN Women has already prepped for what's being called the Beijing +30 Action Agenda. It's a framework that includes 6 priorities: digital revolution, we've been talking about that, freedom from poverty, zero violence, equal decision-making, peace and security, and climate justice. How do you see this agenda being implemented over the next 5 years?
Well, I think as we've already understood, we are a long way from achieving gender equality. The fact that we are, again, putting it at the center, a core priority, the fact that, again, we are recognizing that women are the solution, empowering women, creating spaces for women, including them, ensuring that they are safe and thriving is beneficial for societies, it's beneficial for the world. I think this awareness and then exchanging better, obviously pulling more resources towards the UN and ensuring that we as countries are exchanging and ensuring that our exchanges, everything that we are working on has a dimension that includes women. If we can prioritize this, I think these 6 points, this action plan can be closer to being achieved, but I feel it'll take a lot more.
Seema, Zoon mentioned the United Nations there, and of course there's a big conference taking place next month in Brazil. That is COP30, the UN's climate conference. Women are taking a lead in sustainable development, green development as well. This is Wang Yao, the Director General of the International Institute of Green Finance. This is what she had to say. Let's watch.
Women are a key force driving sustainable and green development. In green sectors, particularly since the dual carbon goals were proposed, we see a very high level of female participation. When facing challenges related to sustainability, the environment, climate change, and biodiversity, their resilience drives long-term, sustained support. Furthermore, our national strategies actively protect and promote women's rights, demonstrating comprehensive respect for women across society.
So it's a big meeting. It's another one of these at times when there will be an assessment of how much progress has been made in the battle against climate change. But how can women's participation in this be empowering and drive the major policy decisions?
You know, I mean, I think also just coming out of Beijing, taking a minute to reflect in terms of the progress that's been made, it's an opportunity to do that at COP30 as well. But at the same time, you know, finding these opportunities to put women in power, really measuring the impact. You know, it was only 2020, only 5 years ago, that we started to better understand how women's health was being impacted. And in fact, it was only COP28 that health was even a topic. So imagine that. All these COPs we've had, health was only at the table in a meaningful way most recently. And I think, you know, this is an opportunity. This COP is an opportunity to really focus on enabling women and to reflect as a call to action. You know, women, as we heard, you know, they're not the problem. You know, they're not a challenge to be solved. Investing in women is truly like investing in a multiplier that will pay dividends in all kinds of ways, from an environmental perspective, a financial perspective, you know, a poverty perspective as well.
Yan Liang, President Xi also announced during the conference that China will donate $10 million to UN Women and $100 million to China's Global Development and South-South Cooperation Fund. What are the implications for the recipient countries that are seeking to advance women's development?
Right. Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think this is a time when developing countries are struggling with financial resources, and a lot of the government programs are cut because they have to pay external creditors the debt services. And so what that means is that when you cut education, when you cut healthcare, when you cut all these social welfare programs, it really not only adds more burden on women, but also I think it reduces space for women to be able to participate in economic lives and also their political, you know, leadership, as we mentioned earlier. And I think, you know, China's programs are going to help not only in the financial resources, but as Zoon talked about earlier, you know, really some of the sort of role model effects to show the rest of the world, you know, how gender equality and gender inclusive policies can be made, and providing all the resources to women. And I just wanted to, you know, emphasize one last point, which is, again, women leadership. I think right now, you know, women still only occupy 27% of the parliament seats, and only 23, you know, central bankers in the world are women. But I think, you know, having women in the leadership role has proven, right, to have more endurable peace, to have more profitable businesses and more inclusive policies. So I think, you know, it is not a sort of a competition, or it's not, you know, only women would benefit from being in the leadership role. So I think we really need to carve out the space and try to find the ways from legal means, from financial resources, economic resources, to enable women and allow women, right, to be in that leadership role. And I think that benefit not only women, of course, but really, you know, the all, you know, humans and the global economy and society as well.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.